When I first went to India, it was a very easy thing to write about Mughal history. Very little it was available at a popular level in bookshops. It was a field which was open to all sorts of new discoveries. Today, it is a field which is under siege in all sorts of ways. You can go to the National Museum in Delhi and barely see a single Mughal artifact on shore. A few miniatures still, but very marginal to the main message. And in the last 20 years, the image of the Mughals has moved from being highly thought of builders of India's most famous monuments, notably the Taj Mahal, to being marginalized as sort of depraved jihadis in many popular versions of their history. Now, there are few scholars who've done more to fight back against this than Ruby Lal, who from her command center in Emory has been waging a fantastic historiographic counter-narrative, but centered particularly and remarkably on the women of the Mughal Empire. This again is a field which has suffered some very dubious historiography over the years. The first book I ever read on it before Ruby was by a man called K.S. Lal, who wrote a book on the Mughal harem, the site of depraved orgies. And that was very much the tone. Ruby has changed all this, and in a whole series of scholarly works, first on the Mughal harem, then on particularly Nur Jahan, but on several other books, has been pushing back at this narrative and revealing the women and their enormous power and influence at the heart of Mughal society and Mughal scholarship. So Ruby's going to give us a little peroration, a little introduction, and then we're going to knock it backwards and forwards after that.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Great. Thanks, William. But first of all, really, you've been the leader in nonfiction. And I remember you saying that it was your dream to put Mughals on every bookshelf in every library of the world. And I think here we are really experiencing that. What I thought I would do for us to get started is to read you a page from my new book. I think it would be a way of sharing my own long-standing relationship with this world. But also, this book begins in this library and my encounter with Princess Gulbadan, holding her manuscript, Oriental 166, that's housed here. So I thought I'm just going to start with that moment when I first held that manuscript in my hand. I was just freshly here from India in the 1990s as a graduate student. So this scene is August 1997, the British Library, right here. I waited with nervous anticipation as I skimmed through the card catalogue in the tall wooden cabinets behind the service desk of the Asian and African Studies reading room. A majestic, high-ceiling rectangular room, it had several long tables, each of which could comfortably seat up to 4 readers on each side. Lamps with light blue shades stood in contrast to the yellow tables. Large portraits of Indian Rajas and other aristocrats from the former British colonies dominated one side of the high walls. Rows of bookshelves holding printed guides and other catalogs drew patrons' attention. Every now and then, the library staff looked towards the area where the readers pored over the special collections. Earlier in the day, I had asked to see the 16th century Princess Gulbadan Begum's book, classified as Oriental 166 in the British Library. Gulbadan, literally rosebody, was the beloved daughter of Babur, the patriarch of the magnificent Mughals of India, and the first and only woman historian of the Mughal Empire. Writing as events unfolded, she captured the gritty and fabulous daily lives of ambitious men, subversive women, brilliant eunuchs, devoted nurses, gentle and perceptive guards and captive women and children who had died in war zones. Yet Gulbadan's stellar book was relegated to the margins of history, to mere footnotes in volumes on Mughal politics, war, economy, and agrarian histories, all written by men. Before I left India for Oxford, I had seen a 1902 English translation of Gulbadan's work by the fabulous Annette Beveridge, a British colonial era scholar. It was obvious that Gulbadan was a woman of many quests and journeys, yet her work had been sidelined by modern historians who shared Beveridge's publisher's belief articulated in a letter accepting the translation for publication. So this is 1901, and this is what the letter said, that it, the manuscript, quote, was of unique interest, a little history, it is but a little thing, unquote. So the little history of men's and women's daily lives that enraptured the princess is in fact a masterpiece that came out of an insightful witnessing of heart, politics, and much more. No distant bystander, she was close to the people whose lives she chronicled. Thus a book was both hers and theirs, a lively prose that shines with unrivaled granular details of Mughal wandering life. So on that August 1997 morning, as I waited to hold the book of this adventurous woman, I did not yet know the depth of her radical thinking, her daring life story, tied intricately to one of the greatest adventures in the late 16th century world. 2 decades would pass before I joined together the pieces of her fascinating life, and it's here.
Ruby, so for those that don't know the background, give a little quick peroration round who Babur was, where was Gulbadan born, what was this world she was born into?
I think the one thing that will capture, one way to capture all of these questions is, and one that I have really gone after, is what is a peripatetic ethic? What does it mean when people move? Movement and migration is, of course, much of human history, however much modern nation states deny that fact. So Babur was a peripatetic monarch, illustrious descendant of Timur and Genghis Khan. He eyed Samarkand, lost it 3 times, established his household in Kabul.
Captured at age 16.
At age 16, yes. And established his household and a military base in Kabul, actually Bala Hisar right here. This is a 19th century excavation. And Hisar, meaning a fort citadel, which means it was both a military encampment as well as residential quarters. So right on top were the residential quarters where Gulbadan was born in 1523. And so when she was born, Babur was already involved. He was looking towards the area beyond the river Indus, Al-Hind.
And he was himself a refugee at this point.
And
He
yes.
had to flee in front of the Uzbeks coming into what's now Uzbekistan.
That's right.
Yeah.
So he had lost Uzbekistan, bartered his sister Khanzada Begum to secure exit, safe exit, and then, of course, he had a foothold in Kabul, and this is where Gulbadan is born. But the important thing to remember is it is this peripatetic, wandering, constant movement that really defined this time. So the illustriousness came out of the bloodline, but the consequential sort of point was living out in the country in tented gardens, living in caravans. And Gulbadan was 6 when the first caravan went to India under Babur's invitation to Agra that he had just then captured.
And again, just before we head down to India, give a picture of how extraordinary erudite Babur himself was. That this man from an area that we might consider to be the back of beyond, in fact was a man who represented in himself the height of Timurid civilization, was a beautiful writer, one of the great memoirists of history.
Yes. He was a man of curiosity. He was a man who looked at things, he took things, and as he moved, he constantly wrote. And it's a fantastic diary of his observations on nature, on animal life, on the riverine tracts, on the hills, tribes, the most extraordinary and unusual
The difference
set of
between
observations.
getting drunk on wine
Yes, there
and
is
chewing
that
opium.
too. There is that too, and that is part of the kingly sort of demeanor. But I do want to add that, like him, it is also the stupendous women who are traveling with him, highly cultivated, as curious, as essential. I just mentioned Khanzada Begum, his sister, who literally saved the man by bartering herself to his ardent enemy. So Gulbadan is trained within the terms of these amazing ancestresses and this incredible father that she really looks up to.
So, I mean, it's a surprise in itself that a ruler would also be a brilliant writer and memoirist, that he keeps a record of his own life as full as anything written by Pepys, as self-revealing as any memoir or autobiography today. But perhaps even more of a surprise to an audience here that his daughter would even be literate, never mind capable of writing a history. Tell us about the state of women in this world.
Yes, and I think this question of literacy really keeps on coming up all the time. People ask me, were they literate, and what were the terms of this literacy? I think it's in a way a modern conception to think, a specific form of literacy. Literacy here is really what I was speaking about earlier on. It is a cultivation of the self. It is a cultivation of the senses. Of course, there are strict ethical codes here, right? These are the ways in which a girl should be. These are the ways in which a royal boy should be. But there are common things. There are things like, they'll all be learning how to hunt. They know how to be outdoors. They know how to read the Quran. They look at, books were really prized. You didn't have the books of the Mughal atelier at this time, but you had books. And there was a great reverence attached to books. So these are the shared, ways of being and moving and belonging. So Gulbadan writes about, picnics, the visits to the hills of Kabul, the rhubarb picnics that It's the live, exactly. And spending time in the moonlight, right? But the great relationships, also relationships with the eunuch, relationships with the companions, relationships with people who served you every day.
Just to talk about this front up, the traditional view of Mughal women is inhabitants of harems as the satisfiers of men's lust, particularly in books like K.S. Lal. Yes. In actual fact, the only time Babur seems to fall in love is actually with a boy. Yes. What is the place of women in that world, in the world of pleasure?
So that is the key question, and I should clarify, K.S. Lal is no relative of mine. I mean, all my work has been written against K.S. Lal kind of work, which is, as William was saying, stereotyped notions of harem, women laying about, no agency, waiting for the monarch basically to come, and they should do their offerings. Actually, there was no harem, and I mean a sandstone harem in the Mughal dynasty until Gulbadan's nephew, Akbar, becomes the king. So with Akbar, it's part of the institutionalization and bureaucratization of the empire. It's part of development of stunning cities, military practices, economic, and stupendous agrarian histories. So the harem that he builds in Fatehpur Sikri, and we actually do have since it's here, you should just see that this was the requisition slip that I had to work with in order to start seeing Gulbadan's manuscript. But here we go. This is Fatehpur Sikri. This is the public section. Right across there is the mint. This is the Anup Talao, where Tansen is supposed to have played his amazing melodies. Right here, so the functional character of some of these buildings is unclear to historians till this day.
The names they have on the guidebooks are completely modern, aren't they?
Completely
They're not,
modernized.
yeah. So Jodhabai's house is not actually
Jodhabai's house. That's exactly right. So just behind the pleasure pavilion is what was the haram that Akbar built. And basically his idea was, the inspiration came from the holiest of holy Muslim cities, right? Makkah and Medina. These were the most important Haraman-e-Sharif, as they are called. And he wanted women to be in these sacred, inaccessible areas so that they could be revered, so that not every Tom, Dick, and Harry could view them. This was the idea. And so Gulbadan, by this time, of course, in my book and in her life, is in her 50s. She has traveled all over the place, back and forth, witnessed exile, political sort of changes, but basically an itinerant girl and an itinerant princess is then, along with multi-generation women of the Mughal household, is asked to go live in the harem.
No, one of the ideas that the K.S. Lal School of History promotes is that the harem was something quite new, quite different, very Islamic. What would have been the norm in, say, Rajasthan for the cohabitation of men and women? Yes. How were they organized?
So in Rajasthan, of course, you have the Havelis, right? And there's the Zanana and the Mardana. So there is the separation of spaces in the ethical sense and also in practices, that is the man spaces and the female spaces.
So also, this is emphatically not an Islamic introduction.
This is not an Islamic introduction. I think it's a customary practice, and all sorts of arguments are made by Akbar in the Akbarnama in order to start this segregation, right? You have this in royalty across the world. This is basically a statement about reverence. It's about elevation.
Very, very good. And so Gulbadan comes age what to India? She's born in Kabul, but...
She's born in Kabul. She's the first girl to travel in a caravan along the Khyber Pass at age 6. She lives in a mansion across the river Yamuna till age 17. Then she's married in Agra. Humayun, her brother, becomes the king, stepbrother, becomes the king. He's then defeated by Sher Shah Suri.
Before we defeat him, what's her relationship with the young Humayun? Are they close? Are they?
They are very close. Which is why, I mean, you know, the manuscript that she writes, we'll come to that later on. It's called Ahwal-e Humayun Badshah, and there's a reason for having that title, which I can speak about later on. So the relationship is close, but he loses to Sher Shah.
And just again, for those who don't know the background, a little portrait of Humayun, sometimes sort of portrayed as the kind of hippie prince, busy doing sort of divination and kind of quite wacky astrology. Not quite the military man his father was.
No, that's a great question, actually. So in Mughal historiography, you have this tendency to elevate some figures and to downside the others. Akbar is, of course, highly loved because he's supposed to be you know, the incredible guy. I've been with him for 20 years, and I have my own position on him. But Babur is, of course, you know, the poet, the prince, right? You've written on Babur. Humayun is this lovely, moody, sentimental character, right? It's not as if he's not ambitious, right? He's fairly ambitious. He also strategizes, but I think he has tremendous challenge from other stepbrothers, namely Kamran in Kabul.
But he is slightly hopeless, isn't he? I mean, the whole invasion of India is delayed 2 months because he's late.
Yes.
I mean, you don't.
No.
Your dad's trying to invade India, and he's off somewhere having a hunt, or.
Yes, and he
well, I invade in midsummer.
I think he's more interesting than that. I think his conditions don't allow him to be really on top of things, and also there's dismissal from the courtiers because he's not strong enough. But I think if the conditions were right, he could have.
I often think of Sanjoy being the son of an admiral, and Admiral Roy as the kind of naval commander, as the Babur, and Sanjoy as the kind of, as Humayun maybe with the theatre interest.
Sure. Sure.
Luckily, he's at the other session, so we can say. But so again, Gulbadan has to leave when Humayun is defeated, or
Yes, so she's the Mughal dynasty splits. Humayun and a group goes into exile towards Sindh and then eventually to Iran.
nearly gets caught in Jodhpur, is in this,
Yes.
within inches of, like Darashuko many generations later.
That's right.
Will be captured by the Rajputs and brought back in chains to Delhi.
That's right.
Humayun nearly has that.
That experience.
And then, just to push my idea about him being hopeless again, the one thing he gets out is he gets all his jewels.
Yes.
And he leaves, and at one point he goes for a pee beside a river, and he leaves the purse of all the jewels by the river where he's had the pee.
So William.
And then his young page has to ride up with the Kohinoor or whatever it is
Yes,
behind,
yes.
and says, "I
So-
think you've left something behind, sir."
Okay, so I think we are expecting this complete perfection from our kings, and that's
But you
the-
don't leave your jewels.
No. But the good thing that happens when he goes to Sindh is that he meets Hamida Banu Begum, mother of Emperor Akbar, and he's besotted by her. And she
Do they
has
not meet before then?
No, they don't.
I hadn't
And-
realized that.
And she strikes tremendous nuptial agreement with him before she marries him, before she agrees to marry him. But of course, they are in Sindh and in exile. Meanwhile, Gulbadan,
And he's born in Umarkot.
that is Akbar.
Akbar, sorry, yeah.
Yes.
yeah.
Meanwhile, Gulbadan has, of course, been taken by Kamran back to Kabul, which is where she'll stay.
And what's her relationship with the rival brother, with Kamran?
She really dislikes him, and she constantly tells her husband, "Why do you back this man called Kamran? He's not good enough. We should really be backing the person my father wanted to be the emperor." So these are the kinds of intimate, nitty-gritty detail in colloquial Persian that you get from her.
And is there any difference in the female eye that you can discern? How different is her vision, say, to Babur, to her father?
Yes. So while Babur his style is extremely intimate and very engaged and very curious. For example, it's completely devoid of dialogue, right? Whereas Gulbadan is writing very much in the tradition of Kissa Khani, that is of storytelling, the terms within which she's grown up. So it's littered with dialogue. It's
Just like the Shahnameh or...
Yes,
yeah.
yes. So that's the chronicle form. And one of the reasons why scholars had dismissed her, and I'll give you a few reasons which are completely futile and stupid. One is, one translator said very early on, she gets her dates wrong. And I have since been thinking and wanting to ask him, this is a medieval chronicle. This is not modern imposition of dates, right? It's a stream of consciousness style, which is really quite extraordinary. So I love that kind of story upon story, involvement of women, her invocation of Hamida, who becomes her sister-in-law and one of her closest friends, who becomes her major interlocutor in finding out about what exactly happened during exile.
So again, let's go into the exile. So he's fled through Rajasthan and he heads on into Persia. Meanwhile, his sister is up in Kabul with the enemy, with
That's
Kamran.
right.
Tell us about
So
this
then
phase.
eventually, to make the long story short, he gets the backing of Shah of Persia and
promising to
promising
convert.
military support.
But doesn't he promise to convert to Shiism? Is that
The-
story true or
This
not?
is debatable. We are not entirely sure whether this happened. He's supposed to have put on a Shia cap on his head, but these are ceremonial sort of gestures, right?
But the Safavids at this point are Shia fanatics.
That's absolutely
And they
right.
would not have backed someone
That's right.
of Sunni faith.
That's right. But it is also a hesitant moment in Safavid history. It's a little bit later on by Akbar's time that emphatic moment in Safavid history begins. And it is in that context that actually Noor Jahan's parents then leave Iran and come to Akbar's capital. So this is a slightly different moment, more hesitant.
So he gets the backing and he goes first to Kabul,
He goes first to Kandahar.
Kandahar.
So he takes Kandahar from Askari, another stepbrother, and eventually then first sends Akbar to Kabul, where Gulbadan meets him at age 2. Khanzada Begum is still there. They hold her. There's a beautiful festivity. The folio has also been recast of the meeting and is held here. I don't have it here. I have some other folios. And there's a lot of tussle by the time Humayun and Hamida come between Kamran and Humayun. Eventually, Kamran is defeated. By this time, Akbar is 10 or 11.
And who does the defeating? Is it the Persian cavalry or?
The Persian cavalry helps him as far as Kandahar, and then they leave.
Huh.
After that, it
He's
is
on
the
his own.
Mughals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And does he receive lots of exiled help? I mean, is there a sense of a whole load of old mates meeting again in Kandahar and rearming and going?
Yes, all of that, and there are also, because sometimes the next steps are delayed, there are commanders, the Iranian commanders who want to leave. So there are all sorts of negotiations that take place.
So he then takes Kabul.
Yes.
So give us a quick view of what's been going on in India in his absence, the Shesha Suri and...
So, you know, it is not, Shesha Suri does not have all of India. It's basically, you know, parts of Bihar, bits of Delhi, bits of the eastern territories that we are talking about. The taxation system has been refined. The Grand Trunk Road is on its way. Basically, bureaucracy is very much in place. But his sons, who he really wants to go after him, are actually not good enough. And I think this is the moment, militarily not good enough. And this is the moment after Humayun has defeated Kamran, he comes to, you know, he eventually comes to.
So how
India.
long, give us the timing. He's been defeated, he's fled, he captures Kandahar, Kabul, and then he's heading down back to Delhi. What's the time scale of all that?
So 1550 to 1556, roughly speaking, this is happening. 1555, he's already in Delhi. And he rules only for a year. We know the famous story. You know,
Again, assume people don't know the famous story. Yeah.
I'm assuming you know. The famous story is that he's in his killa right on top, and there's a call for prayer, and he's in the library. So he starts to come down, and his foot is trapped in his jame, and he falls down and he dies. Akbar is about 11 at this time, and he becomes the next emperor, yeah.
And Gulbadan is with him at this point?
Gulbadan is in Kabul at this time, and very quickly after that, you know, the ladies will come to Delhi.
And is that like walking into a war zone? Are they sure that Akbar will hold this?
No.
There's no. I mean, we know, of course, that Akbar then manages to create a much greater Mughal Empire.
Yes.
But is there any sense at the death of Humayun that this is just after just a year that the whole thing is going to crumble?
Yes, but the thing is, there's Bahram Khan, right, who's the regent of Akbar, and there's all other officers, and you know, there's stuff in place for the women to come back, but we still don't have Fatehpur Sikri, right? That'll happen two decades later on.
So, take us through what happens to Gulbadan now. She's come back to this. She's lost her brother.
Yes.
It's presumably extremely unstable moment.
That's right.
Everything could go very badly wrong.
That's right.
There's these two brothers, Adam Khan and his other brother, who are dominating the Durbar. The wet nurse who's ruling over everything.
Bibi
Again, another prominent woman.
Yes, yes. So all these. So this is actually a very fertile moment, because while Akbar is, you know, 11 and on, he's a boy king in a way, and highly ambitious. I mean, within no time, 4 to 5 years, he's packed off his wet nurse, who's very influential. He's packed
thrown his teach brother out of a window.
That's right, and of course, Bahram Khan is also gone, his regent. So he's on his way, and from there on, it is one conquest after another, and you know, skillful implementation of bureaucracy, of taxation system, of thinking the grandeur. So this grandeur, this opulence, this wealth, this is the moment of kind of holding all of this together.
But most important, in a sense, for understanding the relationships that today are so bedeviled.
Yes.
It's Akbar, we are always told, who reaches
begins.
out to the Rajputs
That's right.
and brings them into
That's
what
right.
becomes a hybrid polity.
That's right. And marriage, political marriages are definitely one of those signs. And his first Rajput wife, Halka, actually eventually gives birth to Salim, the next emperor, the next emperor, but also the only boy who survives.
Again, we take this for granted, but is this alliance with the Rajputs a surprise, or the same sort of thing that the Delhi Sultans have been doing already?
Well, I would think that this was highly strategic, but also since Babur's time, right, the incorporation of other communities had been taking place in the fold of the Mughal Empire, but also for the Mughals. So this is a two-way sort of negotiation. For the Mughals, it was not the picture that suddenly it's all India, pan-India, and the rest are all gone. That's not. I mean, until Shah Jahan, the Mughals could not capture Deccan. The relationships between the East and the West were extremely fragile. But with Akbar, there's a solidifying of structures that take place.
And Auntie Gulbadan, as she now
Yes.
is observing all this and
Yes.
writing about it.
Yes. She's not writing yet. She's observing, she's counseling, she's participating with Hamida amongst other people. But very soon as, I think we should now come to her. As soon as the haram is built and women have been asked, she sits across from her nephew Akbar, saying to him,
In Fatehpur Sikri.
Fatehpur Sikri, saying to him, long ago I had made a vow to go to the holy cities, and it is time to do so now. And while the nephew and the auntie sat across from each other, speaking about the same subject, I believe they had rather different intentions. She was an itinerant woman, very involved in the project of the empire, but also very committed to an itinerant life. So she now needs to leave the harem. Akbar, who we've been talking as somebody...
The empire and an itinerant life are not at loggerheads with one another, are they? I mean, every ruler at this period all over the world is itinerant.
Is it?
Is itinerant.
Yes.
In medieval England
That's
as much,
absolutely
or France
right.
as much
but,
as...
But there is a gesture that has been made to truncate that, itinerancy, if you will. And I think this is the extraordinary gesture. And he permits her to go because the Islamic millennial is arriving, amongst other things. And like other Muslim monarchs, he has ambitions of being the millennial sovereign. So what better gesture than have your women go to the Holy Lands and accrue blessings. So this is the moment in which she leaves the haram. All this I established in my first book. But till then, that she leaves the haram and that she lives in Arabia for 4 years. I knew both of these things, but I hadn't been paying enough attention to these two aspects, which, as I began thinking about this biography, started to make sense in my mind, and in my gut, I knew that the two were related. There's a third aspect, which is that her manuscript, 166, actually breaks off on folio 83, mid-sentence. And it was a tradition in the Mughal atelier to make more than one copy of such important works. So I began to think there's a relationship between the broken manuscript, her living in the Hijaz. There has to be a story. And that is the scandal I've unearthed now in this book.
So reveal it to us. What's going on?
So the scandal is that she arrives with these women in Arabia. In the documents, we don't know...
Travels by sea from Surat?
Travels by sea from Surat, all of which I have charted. So imagine me leaving as a scholar Mughal India and getting into the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea, which means also actually studying Ottoman Arabian documents. And I'm saying Ottoman Arabian because Western Arabia was at this time under the sovereignty of the Ottomans.
And briefly, even some towns in Gujarat.
And sometimes in Gujarat.
Had been under the Ottomans.
That's right. And this is a key point to the story. Murad III, the Ottoman Sultan, and his ancestors were able to make the claim to be the rulers of Western Arabia by saying that they were the protectors and the servitors of all in Western Arabia. This meant the Bedouins, local authorities, royal visitors like Gulbadan and so on. So Gulbadan arrives and starts distributing the incredible bounties, the mandatory gifts that Akbar the Great had sent with them. But what I discovered in the National Archives in Turkey were 5 eviction orders issued by Murad III against the Mughal ladies. And the word that he uses repeatedly in these orders is called sadaqat. And sadaqat is perhaps the most elevated form of giving in Islam. It means that when you give to somebody, it is not the recipient that's elevated, it is the person who gives that is elevated. So the story is that Gulbadan and the women stood in front of the great mosque of Mecca, they went to Medina, they went to fountains on the road, and they were distributing sadaqat, right? They were giving tons of sadaqat, and Murad issued the first eviction order a year after they arrived. They did not leave. He issued the second eviction order. They did not leave.
They're tough ladies.
They're tough ladies, but they will keep on doing what they were doing.
And what's Murad objecting to? Why is it a problem to have
these
generous ladies?
Because they were walking on his toes, and in terms of his sovereignty was folded into giving. But also 1577, the year they land, 1578, I'm sorry. It was a very harsh year in Arabia. There was, lack of grain. Any number of monumental buildings needed repair. So all of this was on his mind. He had tensions with people in Iran, the Portuguese, and here we are, his messengers telling him that, look, the Haraman of Akbar the Great are there creating all this trouble. So that too is a problem. The Haraman being visible means Akbar the Great is visible, right?
So they eventually do leave. Having overstayed their welcome,
they 4 orders down. Finally, Akbar sends another Hajj commander, and they leave. But as they leave, at the bottom of the Red Sea, in the constricted passage of the Babul Mandab, their ship wrecks, and they stay another 7 months in Aden. It's a story I've charted. I won't say more about that.
So they eventually get back, though, to Surat and then to Agra.
And then to Agra.
And at what point does she begin writing her?
So yes, so 5 years after she comes back, now into the Haram of Lahore, Akbar decides that it is time to have the first official history of the empire, the Akbarnama. And he invites only one woman to write her memories as a contribution towards the Akbarnama. But what she ends up writing is not what everyone else was writing, which is the men are the center, there's wars, right? The greatness of the empire for all time to come. She was writing about everything you and I have been talking about, which is the uncertainty, children dying in wars, women having these heavy negotiations with men, so with Akbar's sensorial tendencies, my estimate is that the pages were redacted because without question, she'll have written about this amazing Hajj. So the interesting thing is...
he stops her or he rips the manuscript up? What's your supposition?
The supposition is that basically the pages are redacted. I mean, the point is that the way I established this is by charting Akbar's sensorial tendencies. He was he had very low temperature for any form of critique. So we know Badauni, his courtier who writes a panegyric, a counter to the panegyric Akbarnama as a criticism of the Akbar's policies. But he does that in hiding. And these 3 volumes come out after the emperor is killed. Akbar also packs off any number of critics to Mecca. So to remove the pages of his elderly aunt.
And the Akbarnama is more to his taste, which is a kind of incredibly unctuous, oleaginous, sort of slightly, beyond sycophantic, sort of bigging up of Akbar by Abul Faisal.
That's
who
right.
seems to be sort of completely slurping with
Yes,
sort of
with praise.
with praise. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
And so Auntie Gulbadan is not sufficiently unctuous for
No,
the nephew's
well,
taste.
that is the point.
Brilliant. So do we know what happens to her at the end of her life?
Yes, she dies a year before Akbar, and the only woman whom he, whose bier he actually puts on his shoulders and walks with some distance to her, to her grave.
Any suggestion that that's sort of penance for having shut her up?
We
and-
hope. We hope. But the manuscript survives. I mean, that is the extraordinary thing about history. That is the point we must remember, that no matter what, some people will will themselves onto history, right? So it's right here. It came as part of the Delhi collection.
No, that's a polite way of saying the loot from the Red Fort in
Well,
1857,
right,
isn't
yes,
it? Yeah?
Yes.
So it would have been in the Red Fort until what the Brits call the Indian Mutiny, what India calls the First War of Independence,
That's
at
right.
which point the collection just gets shipped over here to King's Cross.
Yes, yes, that's right. In 2 trunks.
2 trunks.
And I'm told that Gulbadan's book was in the lesser of the 2 trunks. But the interesting thing is, Annette Beveridge, who did the first actually magnificent translation of Gulbadan's work in 1901.
She writes beautiful prose. I mean,
Beautiful
the Babur
prose.
is there's still no one
Absolutely
has done a more
extraordinary.
gorgeous
I agree.
prose.
Her husband, Henry Beveridge, was translating the Akbarnama at that time. Interesting. So he walks into the British Library and he chances upon Gulbadan's manuscript. And he says to Annette, look, I think there's a treasure there. And he wasn't wrong.
And this, incidentally, is the same Beveridge who starts the National Health Service, isn't
Is it
it?
there?
Yes, it is, yeah. It's the same family, certainly. So we owe them not only Gulbadan, but,
Yeah.
but the National Health Service, the
Yes,
NHS. So.
yes, yes.
So just a final word before we open it to questions, Ruby, about how you see the place of women in Mughal courtly society. Not sex objects, not tucked away behind fountains and silks with pigeons fluttering around, but active participants in court politics, mediators.
Yes, all of that. And I think the important thing is really in histories, and this is the reason why I took to writing biographies or nonfiction, there are various descriptors, is to begin to think the personhood of people. Who are these people, right? How do we think, how are they thinking with their spaces, with their histories, with their families, with their geographies, right? What kind of world is this? And I think in order to think, in this book in particular, the point really is, people ask me, so you've known Gulbadan for 20 years, how do you feel about her now? And I say that I thought right from the start, here was a cerebral, powerful woman. I mean, that's the relationship I had with her. But I've been astounded by her power, by her negotiation, by the drive to do what she was used to doing, which is being on the road. And then this chapter that I have called The Return, back to the harem, I believe, would have been a very different belonging to the harem because she starts a new journey, which is writing her book from that.
And she sets a model for a certain type of scholarly Mughal princess that we see later on reasserting itself, well, particularly with Roshanara.
Yes.
But who else? And
Jahanara.
Jahanara, I mean, yeah, Jahanara.
Only that, the extraordinary thing is, Gulbadan is the only woman prose writer, not only from the Mughal Empire, but from the entire Islamic belt of her era. So what the women do afterwards is classically poetry or Sufi treatises.
Does Jahanara not write prose?
Sufi treatises. I mean, we are talking about a political, historical commentary, right? That's the point. So the Sufi, more religious-oriented, books are done, and Jahanara definitely writes about that.
So could the suggestion be that the women are less prone to the kind of matlabi flattery that sycophancy that Abul Faisal gives,
Yeah.
while Gulbadan gives a clearer-eyed, more honest history, which isn't welcome at court.
I've been obsessed with this form of the chronicle. I think one cannot, in either of the two cases, it's hard to speak about the truth, only what the form is telling us. And I think the form of the chronicle is a lovely medieval form. In fact, that's the form, if I could, I would write my next book in.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause, please, for Ruby Lal. Who would like to ask some questions? Front row.
Thank you. It's an extension to your question, actually, so it was nice that you asked the question. Truly an honor to be here. I can speak to you afterwards, but your last book, The Empress, inspired me on a 5-year journey, which eventually ended up as a permanent space, a Mughal woman, hopefully, in Manchester, so we can speak about that later. But yeah, truly inspired by the work that you're doing. What I ask, and again, it's going back to the very beginning when William introduced you, is how much documentation by women of that era exists yet to be uncovered or explored?
Yes, I think that's a great question. I mean, Gulbadan's, if we are talking about the peripatetic monarchs, that is, Babur, Humayun, and early reign of Akbar, then Gulbadan pretty much is the only prose chronicler. But I would also say that when we want to write about experiences that have been put into oblivion, and I say put into oblivion because, as I've been implying, historians are implicit in what we bring to life and what we don't bring to life. I think the question must never be that do I have the sources or I don't have the sources, right? I think the approach to sources or the practice of dealing with sources, I believe, is the most difficult, but also the most exciting aspect. So, for example, paintings, right? Paintings are not just, as you know, not just simple inserts into books. They have, iconographies of particular kinds that we must learn to grapple with. In the last 10 years, especially since I've been writing Empress, I've been aligning with art historians to actually learn about Mughal art. I'll give you one example here from the British Library. This painting from the Akbarnama Oriental 1 to 988 has this glorious depiction. And actually this scene, so Hamida, Humayun, and Akbar at Akbar's circumcision ceremony that was held in Kabul, and that was beautifully recorded written textually by Gulbadan. So Gulbadan's book actually becomes, in a folio of Akbarnama, the inspiration to have this. The extraordinary thing for me was one lovely moment here, which is there is a woman standing there holding her book, right? If this was a man, speaking of historiographical practice, right, suppose it was Humayun, nobody will have doubts about it, right? But because there is a woman holding a book, it took us some time to actually sit and put things together in order to establish that this is Gulbadan. The biggest evidence for this is, of course, that there is no other woman in the dynasty who could rightfully be represented in this era holding a book of her own. But also, then we have, this is a stylized painting of a woman with a book in Chester Beatty, and Linda York Leach has suggested that this is stylized, but this is nobody else but the imagination is Gulbadan. So this is also from the Chester Beatty. Basically I'm bringing out these paintings to show you paintings with the books and how many of these exist in order to understand the iconography of how the book is painted, first of all, what the color is. So for that, this is a contemporary painter of Gulbadan, Keshu Das. Here, self-representation holding his own book. And right here, also by Keshu Das, with the book on the underarm, right? So these are the iconographies that you learn with art historians. So my sense is, how much do we know? It doesn't matter, right? We know enough. What do we do with it? So one more example, because this is a very important question. One more example. So when Gulbadan sets out from Surat, right? It took usually 3 to 4 weeks till they reached Jeddah. And I wanted to think, you know, what did the ships look like? What happened when they were traveling? And I was consulting the Akbarnama here, and on the side, I came across this extraordinary narration by the Hajj commander, in which he writes a letter to Akbar saying the two ships, Jahaze Salimi and Jahaze Ilahi, they were sailing together, and a week into it, from the ship of Gulbadan, a boy fell into the sea, right? And it was very dark, and so they had to lower the boats to bring the boy up. The boy was brought up. But the Khaja also wrote, saying, you know, we had a big debate whether we could put the lanterns onto the deck because that would invite sea monsters. And so I began to think, you know, what sea monsters? How are they represented? So these are the steps. I'm just sharing because it's part of my practice of writing and thinking.
Any other hands? The very dapper gentleman on the stairs. Have a microphone just so we get it on the recording.
I'm curious about the cultural experience of Gulbadan, of course, but Babur as well, when they arrived in Delhi, well, Agra and then Delhi. Did they feel like foreigners? How foreign were they? How different was the Delhi Sultanate culture, which, as I understand, was more Turkish influenced, while Babur and his family were more Persian influenced. Is that correct? I might be completely wrong. So how foreign was it to her? Did she feel a foreigner when she arrived?
Well, I think there's a discussion of angst, both by Babur and Gulbadan, but not in the terms of, obviously they would not call themselves foreigners, right? Not in that way, but in the sense of new geographies. So many other things. Geography is just...
There is a sense in the Baburnama that this
That's
is somewhere very
different.
Very different.
Exactly. Yeah. So from the hills of Kabul to the riverine tracks, right? So you have to imagine the food will be different. The dress, sense is different. You know, you have the bazaar very close by, just across the river, where you're hearing Hindavi, you're hearing bits of Bengali. The languages are different. For the household itself, they are multilingual. I mean, it's the Turkish in Gulbadan's book. It's written in Persian, which becomes the kind of accepted language of court chronicles by Akbar, but it has smattering of Turkish. It has smattering of Hindavi, right? So there are all these things. So geography, Babur, of course, classically, now this one is really well known and it's been used in all sorts of bad ways, that he really missed the gardens. And so he starts these gardens on the terrain of the...
It's an odd claim, though, because there were gardens in pre-Mughal India.
That's right.
I mean, we know they survive in the Deccan.
And Rambagh, I mean, where he builds his first garden is actually a garden, right?
Already, yeah.
Yeah, exactly right.
But he thinks they're not ordered enough, they're not symmetrical enough.
Yes, that is the trick. I think he wants to give this, the char symmetry to it, and he wants water in certain ways. And so these are beautiful descriptions in Gulbadan's book about, my father took me to this garden and a grove of oranges was being planted. I mean, she writes so beautifully about the first time that she sees a parrot, right? Things like that. So these are signs of change that are taking place.
But I don't agree with the idea that the Delhi Sultanate is more Turkish.
More Turkish, that's right.
In that by this stage, ever since the Mongols come in, they drive down into Central Asia. They drive down Persian speakers from what's now Afghanistan into Delhi. So by the time of the Khaljis, late Khaljis, and early Tughlaqs, there is Delhi has become a center of Persian civilization and literature, and the House Caste Madrasa was a major center of Persian scholarship. So I think one of the great advances in scholarship that still has to come is a clearer look at the Delhi Sultanate.
That's right.
Because there's an awful lot that we assume is new with the Mughals that actually seems not to have been quite so new as we take it on face value from Mughal chronicles that it was new.
That's right. That's right. That's absolutely right. I mean, and I think the early sultanate, especially Iltutmish and Aybak, they're very representative of this ethos that you're describing, William.
We have Ira Mukherjee in the audience, and she's also written a book on Mughal women and on Akbar. Do you have any comment you'd like to make?
Thank you, yes. I was trying to hold back unnecessary comments at this stage. You know, Ruby, I'm a huge fan of you and your work. But having written a biography of Akbar, I can feel the emperor hissing in my ear and saying I have to speak up for his reputation at this point. It has always been my kind of just instinctive feeling that Akbar had a huge amount of reverence for Gulbadan his entire life. I just am not sure about the redaction part of it. I have my doubts about whether Gulbadan, when she was given the order to write her memories of her father and her brother, specifically Babur and Humayun, I think she would have followed that quite closely to the letter, knowing that she's bearing witness to those men, and would have written about her memories in relation to these two men. I'm not convinced that she would have thought her own journey to the Hajj as being worthy of recording. If I'm not wrong, I think she stops around the time Hindal dies. And I think the ladies were really, really heartbroken at the death of their youngest brother. And to me, somehow it is sort of a correct chronology going towards the end of her recording. So just a small observation for the Emperor Akbar's sake.
Yes. No, he is, I mean, a very interesting man, and I think it's part of this playfulness that all sorts of things become possible. I will disagree with you on the redaction for very good historical reasons. One is, if you look at the colophon in the manuscript, the book was actually held until in the Imperial Library until the time of Shah Jahan. And he actually writes in the colophon that, you know, this book was commissioned by my Baba, and it covers the reign of Baba. In the 19th century, any number of Urdu critics actually wrote around this book, especially when Annette Beveridge's translation came out. There were a couple of commentaries that came out around this subject in Urdu. That spoke about the much longer manuscript that actually existed. So these are the terms within which, and the most vital thing for us to remember is that, it's not, there's only one copy, oh, let's go find one. It's not that kind of case. I think there is a very serious case here about why is it that you have 6 copies of Bayazid Bayat, who's writing exactly at this time. You have 6 copies of Johar, who's exactly writing at this time. So, and then there's this last aspect about Abul Fazl's writing himself and the amount of things that he was censoring, which Irfan Habib has written extensively about, right? So it's part of this amalgam. What I'm not interested in doing is telling the truth. What I'm interested in doing is showing the layers of action that surround the void, right? That is the point.
One thing I think we should say is that it's by no means certain that the manuscript, the longer manuscript, if it existed, may not yet turn up. My own experience in this building with Mughal manuscripts is that the cataloguing was done when it arrived here very quickly. And I've got out any number of late Mughal sources that have turned out to contain other works that are not mentioned in the manuscript, or which are completely different from what the catalogue suggests they will be. And there are large numbers of manuscripts here which I've every reason to believe have never been looked at. And that's just here. And then you go to places like Tonk in Rajasthan, where there are entire Mughal libraries that barely have been, have 1 or 2 line descriptions. So there are, if you learn Persian and get to be able to read this stuff fluently, there are huge discoveries to be made in this field. And the number of fluent Persian readers diminishes every year, not just here, but in India. There are actually very few people who can read High Mughal Persian in manuscript. It's a very, very small club. And there's every reason to believe that future scholarship will move this dial in all sorts of directions that we may not imagine it now. I think, time for one last question. We got, one last question here, a very brief one. And then we pack up.
Thank you. That was a very wonderful conversation. My one final question was, you've mentioned Gulbadan being influenced by her father, her brother, and even her nephew, and she's traveled a lot. How does her experience play into the politics when policies were being drafted in the courts?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lovely question, and there's no way we will know. I mean, the women participate quite actively in directing certain decisions, that we know, whether they are war decisions or other forms of advice. But also, the moments of that advice are rather different from how we understand them. So to give you one example, birthing children was constantly being told by older women to younger women. Now, birthing is obviously in that time not a moment of a bourgeois, sensibility of our children together, but one of longevity of the empire, right? So it was a vital, aspect. I don't see as we go forward towards the grand imperium, right? The Mughals always remained peripatetic, but not in the ways in which we see of the first 3 emperors, but that tendency remains. And women, the other women, the one that follow, are very much part of this sensibility. So those are the things, but not directly in policy, right? They were landholders, for example, but whether they directed policy, I'm not entirely sure.
In your first book, you talk about Mughal grandmothers acting as mediators between warring princes.
That's right. That's absolutely right. But of course, then Noor Jahan is a very different example, right? Where we have nishans, which is a kind of a formal declaration of kingship. And her nishans are actually about protection of peasant rights, for instance, or the protection of the rights, land rights of one of her treasurers. So that's a very different sort of, level of engagement with the policy, if you will. Hamida Banu Begum serves as the governor of Delhi, right? When Akbar was away in Kabul at that point. So another sort of gesture, but not directly policy. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please a big round of applause.